Greetings everyone, my name is Dominic and today you're tuning in to the Comic Book Report, where we review comic books and graphic novels so you can get an idea of what to read. And today I've prepared a quick list video for all of you. That's right, today we're doing Where to Start X-Men. For me, I've always considered this the most notoriously hard to break into superhero franchise in the big two, and I'm breaking down some of my favorite entry points for those prospective or newer readers to the franchise. Before we jump in though, I do want to shout out our channel sponsor, OrganicPriceBooks.com. If you're interested in picking up your own comic book collected editions, maybe some X-Men, I encourage you to check out their website. You can find a link for it in this video's description, and if you see anything there you like, you can even use my discount code at checkout, The Comic Book Report, to save $2 off of your order. Please note if you use my affiliate link or code to make a purchase, I will earn a small commission, but it's a fantastic way to support the channel. Thank you so much for considering. Now let's get started with the X-Men. Okay, first up, X-Men by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. We do have some other creators jumping in on this book as well, Roy Thomas being a notable name as well for me. This is the original X-Men run, or at least the beginning of it. To present it, I am showing you my copy of X-Men Omnibus Volume 1. This was reprinted a couple of years ago, and I'm happy to have it in my collection. I will admit as well, I haven't completed this run. I haven't read all of the initial X-Men run. I think it is a little bit tough to get through. It is an older Silver Age title, and it feels a bit dated. I feel like it doesn't really have the punching out power of something like The Amazing Spider-Man or Fantastic Four, some of this run's contemporaries at the time. That being said, there's still a lot to love about this early X-Men run from what I've read. I love how much of the lore it introduces and establishes, even from the very beginning. Stan Lee introduces us to the Merry Mutants of Marvel. We have that, and what I love about it is it's different than your standard other superhero comics that there's some big origin moment. No, mutants are just kind of genetically predisposed to trigger their mutant abilities at some point in their adolescence, and that is just who they are as people. I really think that this is a novel concept and a bit of a departure from some of the other superhero origin-based fare that we had going on at the time. The art we have from Jack Kirby and others as well is crisp and clean, which I always love to see. One of the things as well, I love that you would get introduced to some of the main characters that are still X-Men mainstays to this day, all the way at the very beginning. That main team of X-Men with Cyclops, Iceman, Beast, Angel, and of course Jean Grey, the Marvel Girl, all headed by Professor Charles Xavier. And in the first couple issues, we have the appearance of Magneto. You know, he shows up right at the very beginning, the arch villain, sometimes ally of the X-Men team. And I love that we have all of that just from the beginnings of this franchise. I think that when you think about where to start a series, sometimes you just have to go back to the very beginning to just get a whole kind of comprehensive look at a book from soup to nuts. I do think it's a good place to start. Again, it is a little bit stilted. I think it feels very episodic. You can read an issue or two and set this book down. You don't need to binge read a series like this. Of course you can, but I think that this really lends itself to when you want to go back to the Silver Age or just read some of the earliest appearances of your favorite X-Men characters or just enter into that world for the first time. I do think that this is still a very fun place to start. And if you're a completionist or someone that likes to read something in the proper order, how could you not include the very first issue of X-Men? Okay, next up on my list, The Uncanny X-Men by Chris Claremont. This is the beginning of his era on the title. Technically, this book starts with the Giant Size X-Men issue, which was not by Claremont, but he takes over immediately afterwards based off the status quo they set up in that giant-sized issue. To showcase this era, though, we're going to be looking at The Uncanny X-Men Omnibus Volume 1. For me, on this list, this is probably my favorite place to start reading X-Men. For those that don't know, Claremont wrote on the book for I think over 2 decades. He also came back at different points later in the X-Men franchise, but he is really the architect of a lot of modern X-Men convention, and certainly the big boom of the X-Men that happened throughout the 80s and 90s is in large part due to his impact on the book as he wrote throughout that entire time. He began though, I believe, in the late 70s here and just kept writing. This is a really fun run. Giant Size X-Men is what introduced us to the team that has has characters like Storm and Colossus, Nightcrawler, and of course Wolverine. Although Wolverine wasn't created for the giant-sized X-Men issue, this is where he first was affiliated with the X-Men team, and of course he went on to be on this team for a large part of the Claremont run. This is such a fun way to jump into X-Men. It both honors the original tradition set up by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby back in the day, but it gives us a total refresh and restarting point for the X-Men franchise. It introduces us to the new team that ultimately heads most of this early run, and it's just a perfect place to on-ramp new readers. I think for me, even though these issues were written in the late 70s through the early 80s, it's still totally accessible reading. Yes, it may feel a little dated, especially in the very beginnings of the book, but once Chris Claremont starts to settle in, it really hits its stride, and it's not long before we have truly classic issues in this collection. What I love too about Claremont's writing style is he is a master of subplot threads that ultimately become mainstream bigger plot lines down the road. The way he juggles seemingly random details that ultimately end up having real story implications later on, I just think is really masterful, and it really reads authentically in a way that it just reminds me of real life, where there's these little moments, these small things that come up that might end up paying off bigger later, and I feel like the fact that that's captured in a couple issues of a comic book, it's just really impressive the way he layers the narrative. Because of that, though, it is hard to jump into his run at later points because he'll bring things up, like I said, from much earlier on. But to start from the beginning of Uncanny X-Men here, this is just a really fun starting point. Again, I mentioned it at the beginning of this segment, but this is my definitive choice of where to start reading X-Men. You still get a lot of the classic stuff while not going quite as old as the Silver Age. Definitely don't miss out on the Uncanny X-Men by Chris Claremont. And hey, if you're enjoying this video so far and you've yet to subscribe to the channel, I would just like to invite you to do so. I'm always doing comic book list videos like this, comic book reviews, unboxings, and more. Thank you so much for considering, and now on with the show. Next up on our list today, The New X-Men by Grant Morrison. To showcase this run, we have the omnibus edition that was just reprinted the other year. This is a run I've always wanted to finish, and I finally had an opportunity to do so shortly after this book was re-released in the last year or two. What I love about this run is I find it to be fairly accessible to new readers. We're reintroduced to a lot of the primary cast of characters. We have a shuffling of that main X-Men team with the notable inclusion of Emma Frost, a really fun addition to the roster. We have so many gifted artists throughout this run, including the great Frank Quitely, who I enjoy. But I think what really brings me to this table for this run is Morrison's work itself. Morrison to me has always been a creator that just really pushes the boundaries of cerebral comics in my mind. I think so many of the runs we have from Morrison are so heady and just interesting to just kind of deconstruct and play with. And that's certainly true of this X-Men run here. One of the things I also like, though, is that this is a very accessible Morrison title. Sometimes works by Morrison, though very cerebral and interesting, can also be a little bit untethered for me. I think sometimes I really have to sit down and chew on some of the concepts Morrison introduces. But for me, the run on New X-Men here, I think is really appropriate to a larger range of audience members. I think even if you're not into deeply philosophical or kind of head-trippy kind of comics, you can still enjoy the concepts that Morrison presents here without being too lost, if that makes sense. I think that this is really just an accessible run to X-Men and Morrison in general. I think that this is also a really stylish and kind of punk rock X-Men. I don't know how else to say that. We have kind of the gritty, more leather looking outfits. Every character has a bit of a hard edge in a way that's just interesting and evocative. The characters and concepts that are introduced throughout Morrison's run as well really added a new spoke to the wheel of X-Men in many ways. I think that this was a real revitalization of this franchise in general. Not that it had gotten soggy or passé, but I think that Morrison really infused a lot of just freshness to this run. Like I said, it felt edgy. I remember when these issues were being talked about earlier on in my comic book journey, and certainly reading them for myself, I understand why this is a much celebrated run. I do think that this run can be a bit polarizing for some people. If you're not into the overall edge or tone that this presents, maybe this isn't your place to start X-Men, but I still think it's a really accessible run, and for me, I thought it was totally interesting and super engaging. I really like all the characters we have present as well. The main team of X-Men has some of their mainstay characters characters while introducing a whole cavalcade of new ones. And yeah, this is just a really fun read. If you're interested in more details, I did do a full review on the channel of this book. It does have some spoilers, but it gives you a little bit of a fuller idea of what this contains. But I do think that this is a great place to start X-Men, particularly modern runs of X-Men. Next on my list of where to start reading X-Men as another on-ramp or potential option for you, and that is what this list is, just different options on where you can start reading. This is not the order in which to read. This is not me saying these are the ones you have to read to begin. This is me saying these are individual entry points you can consider if you want to get your toe in the water of X-Men. To that end, this is the Astonishing X-Men by Joss Whedon and John Cassaday. This was incidentally pretty much my first X-Men run. This is my real entry point into this franchise. I'd read maybe some of the earliest stuff or was familiar with some of the Claremont stuff, but this was the comic that really got me into the title. I think I borrowed an initial collection of some of these issues from a friend once upon a time. I had a Ultimate Collection paperback of the first half of this run, but I was finally able to get the omnibus edition here a couple years ago with one of the reprints. I do believe at this time of the recording, this is currently out of print, but you can find it on secondary marketplaces or by used, things like that. But this run for me is a quintessential X-Men experience. This does take place directly after the new X-Men era from Grant Morrison I just spoke about earlier, but you by no means need to really read any of that to enjoy this book. Of course, the more you read of X-Men, the more this run probably pays off, but they do a really good job of giving you what you need to know to enjoy this title, and they go in a whole new direction, which is a blast. One of the things I really liked about this collection is we also got kind of a previously on little section that was almost like a prologue that caught you up on some big milestone events in the X-Men universe that they will touch on in this book, and I really felt like that was the perfect primer to enjoy this series. And I remember when I first read this book, again, one of the first X-Men books I ever read, I never really felt lost or that I was missing out on too much, especially with the little prologue there. I felt like I had everything I needed to enjoy a really great, grounded, character-driven story. This is a really fun team book that takes the X-Men in some just really fun directions. I do think if you're a longer-term fan of X-Men and you've never read Astonishing X-Men, it is definitely a run I recommend to longer-term fans as well. It does pay off on a couple kind of legacy moments of the franchise in some fun ways. But again, I just think it's packaged for new readers in mind. I think that Joss Whedon really does a good job of making it accessible and open to people that maybe are just casually interested or aware of the X-Men, and that you can just really jump into some really good storytelling. I think we mainly have about 2 giant stories in the entire run, maybe 4 at most, but they're just kind of these bigger maxi stories. They almost feel like big mini-series in many ways. Why I like this is that this is a run that does not feel episodic. It's not like each issue is its own story. We just have these big, grander scale narratives, and I think I really liked it for that. The art we got from John Cassaday is absolutely gorgeous. I think that this is really what put him on my map as just one of my favorite comic book artists in the industry. So if you're a fan that wants to get into X-Men and just likes good art, this is one I would definitely recommend as well. It's just a really beautiful book. I think it has a little bit of something for everyone, and it's just a really great place to start, and it's always an X-Men run I like to recommend. Don't miss out on Astonishing X-Men. And last but certainly not least on my Where to Start X-Men list, this is one of my favorite modern recommendations as well. This is House of X Powers of 10 by Jonathan Hickman. This is the start of what is now being called the Krakoa era of X-Men. This really, like some of these other runs before it, reestablished the X-Men and just kind of give us a whole new status quo for Marvel's Merry Band of Mutants. What I love is that this is an event book, really. This is a maxi series or kind of 2 small mini-series put together for one narrative, and it basically just invites us into the world of the X-Men and sets up a whole new standard for what this franchise will be moving forward. House of X Powers of 10 not only shakes up the Marvel Universe, but it completely shifts the dynamic for the X-Men and all other adjacent X titles. The art throughout it is absolutely stunning, gripping, and immersive as well, but it's really the writing of Hickman that had me absolutely transfixed to this book when I first gave it a shot. I do think that this is good for new readers. I think some people feel like that claim is a bit contested, and that's fine. I totally respect other opinions, but I think for me this is a great on-ramp because of the way it reestablishes the status quo. I feel like if you read this as a baseline X-Men book, you can read all of the other following X-Men titles in this this Krakoa era and feel like you have your footing, you have your kind of tether, you have your roots into the franchise for what you need to go forward with a bunch of future narratives. And so I think that this is an on-ramp. This is a perfect on-ramp. I think that no, it is not the beginning. It's not your comprehensive history on X-Men. No, this is an on-ramp to jump into a bunch of different ongoing titles or runs that just had their finish recently. And for that reason, amongst so many others, I do love this book. Like Morrison, I think Hickman is really good at kind of some cerebral storytelling, but for me, he is a master of epic scale storytelling. I think about what he did with Fantastic Four or Avengers and Secret Wars. He just does these large scale narratives, and that's really what this book feels like. All of the issues serve to really set up one major story to reset the X-Men universe in a really profound way. I really don't want to get into spoilers in this video because I think that this book needs to be experienced for itself. Suffice it to say, this is a total science fiction heavy X-Men story. We have multiple different timelines, point of view characters, and everything, again, kind of serves to reset what does the X-Men look like in the modern age? What is the status of mutantdom in the Marvel Universe, in contemporary history, and what's going on with Marvel here today. This era of Krakoa just ended at the time of this recording not too long ago, so this is all still very fresh in comic book history, but this is where it all began. If you're looking to break into the X-Men in a modern age, this is one of my favorite starting points. I also think the storyline in and of itself is a great standalone, just incredible X-Men book, so this is just fun. This was an absolute page-turner for me. This book is almost impossible to put down. High recommend from me. Okay, and can you believe that? That's already going to wrap us up on where to start reading the X-Men. Of course, this list is by no means comprehensive. I can think of maybe half a dozen more places I could easily recommend to start X-Men, but I wanted to keep this list pretty swift and to the point. These are, again, some of my favorite places to start, all the way back at the beginning to one that is still pretty contemporary. Again, I think X-Men can be a bit loaded and just really challenging sometimes to get into because it's not only that main X-Men cast, it's just a whole universe of mutant characters and spin-off books and histories and storytellings all kind of braided and intertwined over just decades upon decades. But there are on-ramps available. Every comic is someone's first comic, as that old adage goes. And again, these are just some great books that I've enjoyed what I've read of, and I just wanted to share with all of you. But in the comments, if you have your own recommendations on where you think is a great place to start reading X-Men, let me know in those comments. I'd always love to get good X-Men recommendations, not just for myself, but for prospective readers out there that maybe clicked on this video trying to find ways to get into this franchise after maybe seeing the cartoon or the movies or what have you. Hopefully we can get some more X-Men fans out there. I know I am one, have been for a long time, and even just looking over these collections again and producing this video, I've just had so much fun. So thank you so much for taking this ride with me, and until next time, this has been the Comic Book Report. Please don't forget to give this video a like, that comment we talked about, and maybe check out another video on your way out. Thanks, have a good one.